Welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Isabel Wilkerson in conversation with John Meacham to discuss her new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. I'm Kate Whitman, Vice President of Author Programs and Community Engagement for the History Center, and I'm honored to be hosting this timely and important conversation. You can purchase additional copies of Caste from Acapella Books at the link in the chat to the right of your screen, and also at the link provided on the History Center's website. As Isabel and John are talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to about 6 or 7 of them, or as time allows. Isabel Wilkerson is winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, and is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller, The Warmth of Other Suns. Her debut work won the National Books Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, and was named to Time's 10 best nonfiction books of the 2010s, as well as the New York Times list of the best nonfiction of all time. She's taught at Princeton, Emory, and Boston universities, and has lectured at more than 200 other colleges and universities across the United States, Europe, and Asia. Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents is receiving glowing reviews and critical acclaim, and no doubt will add to Miss Wilkerson's accolades. Interviewing Isabel this evening is John Meacham, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer. He's a contributing writer for the New York Times Book Review and a contributing editor of Time magazine. He's the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Hope of Glory, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, and American Gospel, as well as Franklin and Winston. Meacham holds the Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that he will also be joining us in two and a half weeks, Wednesday, September 2nd, to talk about his new book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, which is a partnership with the MJCCA. And now I think I will thank Isabel and John both for being here. And John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, appreciate it. Delighted to be in Atlanta virtually. It takes Tennessee and Isabel to bring enlightenment to Georgia, so we want to see you all making good choices going forward. There was an old wonderful moment in the early 1960s when President Kennedy paid a state visit to France, and Mrs. Kennedy was so much more popular than he was that he simply said, "I'm the gentleman who escorted Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. I'm sort of the guy who's just here to run traffic a little bit." Isabel is one of the most important voices in America and in the broader Republic of Letters. It's an honor to be here. And I'm just going to pitch some batting practice here, if you will. Isabel, I'm going to just jump in. Why is this book not called Race?
It's not called Race because, first of all, I want to thank you for being here and participating with this. It's such an honor to be here with you. It's such an honor to be doing this in this particular venue, because this is where I was for the very first event that I ever had as an author, which is when The Warmth of the Sun came out in 2010. It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years. So this is a particularly special experience for me to be here. And that is how I get to the answer to your question. And that is that with The Warmth of the Suns, which was obviously about the outmigration of 6 million African Americans from the Jim Crow South to all points, North, Midwest, and West, I had to look into what was the history that we often don't learn, that many people might not have known. And so in doing so, I had to figure out what was the term I was going to be using. And I don't use the word racism in that book. A lot of people may assume that I did because many people talk about it in that way, but I don't use the term. The term that I used to describe what the people were experiencing wherever they might have been in the South, whatever their background might have been, was a caste system. And a caste system is an artificial hierarchy, an artificial arbitrary graded ranking of human value in a society. And the more that I spent time looking at what was it like to actually live in the Jim Crow South during the years of Jim Crow, which is from basically toward the end of the 19th century and into the 1960s, I came away with the view that caste was the most comprehensive term to describe a world in which it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. It was a world in which the very word of God, the Bible, was segregated in courtrooms throughout the South. I mean, that means that the same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. And when you look at caste, the originating caste system in India, and you look at other caste systems, you find that the idea of purity and pollution and keeping people separate and controlling and surveilling the boundaries to keep the people separate were some hallmarks of caste, and many of the things that I found about what life was like in the Jim Crow South fit that term, and that's what led to this book.
So you raise a billion fascinating questions. One of the things we're experiencing in the country now is a kind of critique of liberalism, not in the red-blue sense, but in the classical John Locke sense of rule of law, individual equality before the law, and opportunity. Your canvas here, which is one of the things that makes the book so fascinating, is not simply America. And so could you take us on a sort of a global survey, if you would, about both in terms of geography, but also in terms of longitude and sort of time. Is caste innate to the human experience? Or is it such an early force in the formations of tribes and nations that it seems to me that the struggle against caste is something, it's hard to imagine anything more elemental, really.
Well, I think it's deeply human to want to categorize. The subconscious wants to simplify its world in order to make sure that it's safe. And so it's deeply human to categorize and to make distinctions among ourselves. Sadly, this can have catastrophic consequences, of course, when taken too far. One of the things that I was looking for, this book is about our country, it's about America. But in order to do that, in order to really dig deep and to try to understand how does hierarchy work in our country, I wanted to look at others. I wanted to look at one thing was the originating, most easily recognizable caste system in the world, which would be India, and to understand how that came to be, how is there set up, where are the points of intersection between that caste system and ours. I'd like to say a little bit about what some of the things that I found, because that was the main focus of my research, which was that caste essentially determines the respect, benefit of the doubt, access to resources or lack thereof, or deprivation of resources, assumptions of competence and beauty, even intelligence, all these things that accrue through no fault of one's own. And of course, nobody alive today is responsible for the inherited rankings and infrastructure of divisions that we now live with to this day. And of course, we live in the shadow of the originating ones, which started with the founding of the country. Before there was the United States of America, there was a colony, the British colony, which is where the divisions and the categorizing of people occurred. In a caste system, there could be any number of metrics used to delineate and categorize people. In India, for example, of course, it's based upon religion and inheritance, and then attached to occupation. And it could have been in the founding of the United States and the exploration of the world by Europeans, where they came in contact with people who looked different from them, and then began to categorize the people that they found. And then in building this country, bringing in people from Africa to be enslaved, to build the country for free. In the process of doing that, creating a bipolar caste system. So that is what happened in this country. But it could have just as easily been any other number of metrics. In fact, religion and heathenism, as it's known, was considered to be the first categorization to put one group over another. The colonists viewed indigenous people that they found to be heathens, and then Africans who arrived, who they brought to enslave, were also viewed as heathens. So the initial impulse to delineate and categorize started with religion, and then it moved into what we now know as race. So race as a construct is fairly new. It's going only back 400 or 500 years. Race as we know it. Now remember, color is a fact. Color is a reality, but race is a social construct. It could have been any number of delineations and categorizations. It could have been, I mean, in the book I make reference to the idea that height could have been used as a designated category to divide human beings up, because that's also equally dependent upon genetic inheritance as to how, whether you're taller or shorter and in between. So these are creations. And so caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It's the invisible bones. I call caste is the bones and race is the skin. And race is the signifier. It's the cue of where one is assigned in the caste system, the bipolar caste system that emerged in our country.
So is caste intrinsic to the human experience, that is going farther back even than Jamestown? Is there a prelapsarian Edenic, to use the Bible, Edenic moment where there were societies rather, that were egalitarian, were inherently egalitarian, and that economic, demographic, cultural forces somehow corrupted that?
Well, you know, every country has and culture ranges, and I'm not suggesting that all are the same. I'm saying though that there are often, religious origins and so much of the divisions that we see. And one of the reasons that one of the justifications for the caste system that was created here was the story of Noah, where one of his sons, Ham, happened to have seen his father naked, happened to come across his father naked, and for that reason he was then cursed. And it's viewed that people of African descent, the Africans that were brought here to be enslaved, were the children of Ham, who were cursed to become enslaved people. This is part of the justification that occurs in a caste system. And so there is a very long-standing there are long-standing patterns of dehumanizing people, categorizing people, going back to biblical times, if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah. And so what have been the most effective strategies for combating caste distinctions that limit justice, opportunity?
Well, you know, I think I should probably say that one of the challenges of a caste system, and one of the challenges that we face, I think, as a country, is that we often have not really known, we have not had the benefit of really truly knowing the comprehensive history of our country, you know, which of course, you know, you've played such a tremendous part in helping to clarify, instruct, and enlighten people on our country's true history. And it's my—
I appreciate that, but as you say, I haven't done a good enough job. We're trying.
Well, I want to say that, you know, when The Warmth of the Suns first came out and people started to read it, I started to hear the same thing over and over and over again from people, no matter what their background was or age, what part of the country I might have been in. People said to me over and over, I had no idea. I had no idea that these things happened. I lived through this era and I had no idea. I mean, there could be, you know, there's probably someone reading it right now and saying, I had no idea. I may get an email or something related to that. And that's because we have not had the chance to really hear from all segments of our society throughout history. There have been many voices that we have not heard from. You know, when I did The Warmth of the Suns, I interviewed over 1,200 people. Actually, I was auditioning them for the right role to be in the book that I was writing. But you know, they had not been. No one had talked to them about their experiences of surviving the Jim Crow system. And so there's so much coming out now that once we become more aware, then we can have a better chance at really understanding it. As I approached this book, I essentially viewed myself as like a building inspector. I mean, here I was approaching what I would call our country as an old house. And we are all like people who have inherited an old house that has, misshapen walls and cracks in the foundation. They have cracks in the foundation because it's an old house, it's a very old house. And we are none of us alive today had anything to do with the building of this old house that we now live in. None of us are responsible for the misshapen walls or the the broken beams that we might find. But once we become aware of what the circumstances are, once we're able to see the bones and the infrastructure of the building, once we've received the report, then it becomes incumbent on us to take responsibility for it. We're not responsible for what happened before, but once we take possession, then we are responsible. And so I would say that that's one of the ways that I have approached this, to try to say that it's not about the beauty of a new kind of language to think about ourselves, allows us to in some ways liberate ourselves from the emotion-laden language that we often are accustomed to, language that we almost can't even hear anymore because we've heard it so much. And so the idea of caste that focuses in on structure and on the architecture of a thing and on the bones of a thing takes out the emotions of guilt and shame and blame, and allows us to maybe to see what is underneath what we thought we knew. I view this as an X-ray of our country, a way to be able to see beneath what we thought we might have known. And I think that there's a great deal of potential, shining a light into these places that we might not have seen before.
It's a brilliant metaphor. And I would argue as efficacious a rhetorical device as I've heard as we go through this period of potential reckoning, right? We have the possibilities of reckoning with it. We also have a remarkable capacity to move on quickly. One of my favorite moments in Tom Sawyer was a preacher came through town, and Tom Sawyer said the preacher was so good that even Huck Finn was saved until Tuesday. And so we have to figure out a way to get saved past Tuesday. Talk a little bit about what inspectors from other cultures, particularly in the 20th century, learned from particularly the American South.
Okay, so one of the places that I knew I needed to go if I was trying to unpack and understand this phenomenon of caste and find ways to understand it that applied to us, I was going to first go to India. India was obviously a place I was going to study very deeply. But then Charlottesville happened, and in Charlottesville, there we saw before our eyes the merging of these of symbols and symbolism of both the Confederacy and of Nazis, the people who were protesting the potential removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville. And we saw before our eyes the people who were carrying these symbols, the symbols that actually cause us to have to think about what is memory of enslavement, memory of the Civil War, memory of our country's history. How is it that we're remembering it, and what do these symbols mean? These people, the protesters, were bringing these symbols together. They were connecting these two cultures across time and across the ocean. And so as a result of that, I became interested in Germany and realized that Germany was significant. They made it significant by seeing the connection. And so then I set out to try to understand how had Germany remembered, how had Germany dealt with its history, how it had reconciled it, if it had, and how it had atoned for it. And so that's what got me to Germany. And then the deeper that I looked, I discovered things and came across things that I just found wrenching. One of them was that it turned out that the German eugenicists actually turned to and consulted with American eugenicists in the years and decades leading up to the Third Reich. I found that I discovered that American eugenicists were writing books that were bestsellers, huge sellers in Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich. Now, of course, the Nazis needed no one. They needed no one on this earth to teach them how to hate. That they knew. They were hating all along. But what they did was they sent researchers to America, and focusing mainly on the Jim Crow South, to study how the Americans had subjugated African Americans. They looked and researched the anti-miscegenation laws, which I must add existed in the majority of the American states at one point or the other. It was not limited just to the South. So they came and the Nazis came and they studied the anti-miscegenation laws. They studied the segregation laws to see how was it that America had segregated and subjugated African Americans. And then what they did was they went back and they debated. They debated these laws that were the American laws as they were crafting what would ultimately become the Nuremberg laws. This was just stunning, shocking, and wrenching to discover.
And one of the beneficial global lessons, actually, if you go forward about, well, just a very few years for when Howard Thurman went to India, is the Indian experience informing the movement that was so important in Atlanta, based so much there. Can you talk about what we learned from India?
Well, we cannot be talking about anything related to Atlanta without mentioning Dr. King's role in this. So thank you for reminding me that, Dr. King went to, so inspired was he by the work, the nonviolent approach that was taken by Mohandas K. Gandhi, that he wanted very much to go to India. He went in 1959. He was received as a visiting dignitary. Indians had been following the civil rights movement, and many Indians took great interest in it, particularly the people who were known as untouchables, now called Dalit. And so when he arrived, he was recognized on the street. He was greeted by and had dinner with the prime minister. So a lovely trip he had there. And then during the trip, he was invited to visit a school that was attended by and run by untouchables, people who were then known as untouchables. And he, upon arriving there, the principal introduced him to the students there, and he said, young people, I want to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from America. And when Dr. King heard that introduction, it didn't land so easily on the ear. It was something that he had not thought of himself as in any way. He had dinner with the prime minister. He had been received as a visiting dignitary, and so at first he was a bit peeved to hear that term, and then he thought about the work that he was doing. He thought about the lives of the 20 million African Americans, 20 million Black people that he was advocating for, marching for, and leading in the civil rights movement. He thought about the fact that even at that moment in 1959. The majority were not permitted, not in a position or allowed really to vote, could not use many public facilities, that they were segregated and separated and were facing great danger as they were seeking human and civil rights. And so he thought about it and he said, yes, I am an untouchable, and every Black person, every Negro in America is an untouchable. So he made that recognition, and he then later spoke about it during a sermon on July 4th, 1965 at Ebenezer Baptist Church, about his revelation and his recognition. And so Dr. King himself made the connection between the Indian caste system and the hierarchy of caste system in the United States.
What, in your view, is the most illuminating example of addressing the problems, the injustices of the caste system? Is it India?
I think that, because of the work that Germany has done in the years after, of course, we know what happened in World War II, the 12 years of just heinous, unimaginable horror and terror that occurred there. In the intervening decades, they have worked very hard to reconcile their history. Nothing is perfect. There's no perfect, answer to everything. But they've worked very hard to make sure that it's a central part of education, that everyone is on the same page about what exactly happened. How did this occur? They have converted the former sites that had been the Third Reich locations into museums and places of education, so that people would always remember, and that everyone could be on the same page about what happened there. And they also have these what are called stumbling stones. These are small plates, brass plates that are embedded in the cobblestones in front of the last known address for the people who perished in the Holocaust. And so that they are seated, they're everywhere. They're all over the city in Berlin. And when you come across them, because they're embedded in the cobblestones, it forces you to bend in honor of them, and it's such a beautiful tribute to people who lost their lives in that horror. And so there are things that can be learned about how does one remember, because a lot of this has to do with memory and getting on the same page about what happened to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Where do you stand at this point on the capacity of the American experiment, the constitutional experiment in self-government, to address these problems?
Going back to the central metaphor of the book, and there are lots of metaphors in the book, by the way. I mean, I could talk for a lot about the stage and so many other things, but I would say that you think about that old house, and after a rain, you don't want to go into the basement. You don't want to have to think about or face what's in that basement, what the rains have wrought. But if you don't go in the basement, it's at your own peril, because whatever's in the basement, you will have to deal with it whether you go in there or not. You will have to deal with the consequences whether you know it or not. Ignorance is no protection against the consequences of whatever you are facing. And so I would say I would never give up. I would never give up, because as we have seen in recent months, we seem to be on the cusp of an awakening, an awareness, a growing awareness, particularly on the part of people who might not have to live with the consequences every day, an awareness and a sense of reaching out. There were protests in all 50 states, after what we saw with George Floyd Memorial Day weekend several months ago. Every state, South Dakota, Idaho, Alaska, Vermont, whatever state where there was not necessarily, it wasn't at that point about race, it was about humanity. And I think that as long as we recognize how much we all have in common, then there's a chance to transcend the artificial barriers and boundaries that have been built long ago, and which we still live with the after effects of. I think that there is hope as long as we can recognize our common humanity. Great.
I'm going to go to questions that have been submitted from our colleagues in Atlanta. What were you most surprised to learn through your research?
I have to say that there's so many things. It's hard to even narrow it down. I think one of the things that stays with me is how across centuries and across oceans and land masses, that three distinct cultures could find similar impulses as they were creating the divisions and the structure, the hierarchy, and similar approaches to enforcing, similar ways of policing the boundaries of that. And so what I mean by that is that the importance of purity versus pollution, the importance of protecting anyone who is viewed as being in the dominant caste, from the potential pollution of those who were deemed to be in the subordinated caste. The idea that water was a central feature that was seen as being critical to maintaining the purity of the dominant group, so that all of these caste systems ended up having that as one of many ways to maintain and enforce it. For example, in India, it was Dalits, or now formerly known as untouchables, could not drink from the same cup or chalice as dominant caste people. In all of these places in the United States, and even in the Third Reich, Jews were not permitted to swim in the same pools as Aryans were. There were rules and laws against that. And there was a similar rule and law in the United States. One tragic case was where in Chicago, a young boy was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he happened to wade into what was viewed as the white water, and he was stoned to death as a result of that. There are many, many cases of the strict adherence to the centrality of the water as an element of maintaining distance and purity between the groups. And I'm just struck by how, across time and space, they seem to have come to that same recognition or conclusion.
Fascinating. Related, what do you think perpetuates behavior and ideas that continue to lead to caste and human ranking?
Well, again, these are not the creations of anyone alive today. In fact, the caste system in the United States, as I call it, was not something that happened overnight. It was an evolution of ideas, an evolution of law that the colonists refined or fine-tuned or clarified as they were, building a new nation. And so these are the kinds of things that existed long before any of us, even our ancestors were thought of. And so this is an inheritance that we have to deal with. And so my view is that we are in a space where we are not responsible for what we have inherited, but we are responsible for what we do with it. I don't know if that answers the question. I'm not remembering where we went with the question.
All right. I think it goes back to what we were talking about is Henry Kissinger once said of the Middle East, there are some crises that simply must be managed, they can't be solved. And so I guess one of the questions I would ask is, can caste be solved or only managed?
Well, I would hope that it could be solved, but again, I presented myself as the building inspector, and the building inspector, if you've been through that, and it can be brutal, because the building inspector could find all kinds of things that you may not want to think about, but that are important because they need better to be dealt with than not. And a good building inspector is comprehensive in what they're looking at, and so that's what I see myself. But the building inspector is not the one ultimately who makes the repairs, the fixes, or whatever needs to be done. They make the report. I'm presenting an X-ray of our country, and it falls to all of us. Wherever we might be in the hierarchy. And of course, the greater the investment that one has, and the more resources one has, then the greater the responsibility in working toward a solution. I would like to believe that there is one, but I am presenting this as a report, you might say, so that all of us who are collectively the owners of this old house can begin the work of coming together to see what we could not see before, and to work together to heal from it.
Related, do you believe we need some sort of national truth and reconciliation process before we can, I guess, just to use your metaphor, before we can implement the report? Or is that part of the reporting process? These folks agree with you. They think that Germany and South Africa have done a better job with their history. And so Maud, I'll leave it to you. Do we need that?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the it's fascinating that in Berlin, in prime real estate, right in the middle of the city, is a massive, necessary, and very moving memorial to everyone who perished in the Holocaust, and it takes up a huge section of the prime space in the city, as it should. And it makes a point of not, it was built by a Jewish American architect, an architect who happened to be Jewish American. And he chose to not have any descriptor or designation or explanation of anything. It's just there, and you know what it represents, because everyone knows the history. Everyone is taught the history. Everyone must know the history, so that because they know the history, there's not a necessity to have all of this additional explanation, because everyone knows clearly what has happened. And I think that the challenge that we face is that we've not all had the privilege, the access to the full history of our country. So I think it's the first thing is to get on the same page, and to know what truly has happened in our country, to know how we got to where we are. I think that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be one of the steps that could help us get there. I think that, one of the things that happened in with the civil rights movement was that much of the legislation was passed, but I don't know how good a job we did as a country in making sure that everyone knew why this was so necessary. That everyone knew how we had gotten to where we are. Is it that, do all Americans know that for most of our country's history, African Americans had been legally excluded from the most basic form of reaching the American dream, which was just to get a mortgage? That the institution which we hear about called redlining just specifically excluded African Americans from being able to get mortgages that their white counterparts were able to get. And this explains one of the reasons why we have such a huge wealth gap in our country. African Americans were only really mainstreamed into the possibility of home ownership in a systematic way in 1968. So that's just a very short window of time for mainstreaming an entire group of people who were enslaved for 246 years, followed by almost 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. So I would like to see us recognize how very short the history actually is in terms of how African Americans have been mainstream, people who were designated as the subordinated caste. How recent this idea of mainstreaming and being included in the full body politic of our country. It's a very new thing within the lifespan of many adult Americans of today.
You've written two remarkable books. You started out as a journalist. Tell us a little bit of your story. What was the journey that got you to this point where you are wisely urging all of us to inspect the building?
Well, I am a daughter of people who were part of the Great Migration. I'm a daughter of people who were survivors of Jim Crow. And, being raised by that, they migrated to Washington, D.C. And growing up in Washington, D.C., surrounded by people who were children or grandchildren of the Great Migration. Everyone around me everyone was somehow connected to the South. There was a deep personal family connection. People were going back to wherever they were from. In Washington, D.C., many people were from North Carolina and South Carolina. People were going back for the summers. So I was surrounded by the experiences and the culture that they brought with them from the South. I was surrounded by the food ways and folk ways and ways of worshiping. It was kind of being what's called actually you might say a Southerner once removed, or a Southerner twice.
You're never removed. You're never.
So I grew up with that, but people were not talking about why they had left. They weren't talking about how it just so happened that all these people arrived in that space. And so that was one of the things that propelled me ultimately to want to write about the Great Migration anyway, because they weren't talking. I mean, my parents were not talking. No one. It's almost as if they had just sprung whole, landing in New York or Washington or wherever they happened to have landed. It's as if that's when their life began, when they had come to the place that they had dreamt of. And yet they kept all the folk ways. I mean, there was, the whole thing about, even the discussions I would be exposed to about, cornbread, the cornbread debate. Do you put sugar in the cornbread or not? That's a whole thing. Do you put sugar in the greens or not? That's a whole thing. That's a conversation. That could be a debate. So I was surrounded by that. And I think to me, that's one of the beautiful parts about being able to tell the story of the people who dispersed all over this country and carried with them the traditions and the folk ways and the food ways and culture of the South, and then made basically Southern culture became embedded into what we view as American culture in that respect. And so that was what propelled me to want to understand the history. Of course, you know that I was a journalist at the New York Times, and when I got the opportunity to write a book, the Great Migration was the one thing I wanted to write about because it so affected me. I'm one of these people who would not even have existed had there not been a Great Migration. My mother was from Rome, Georgia. And
real Rome, yeah.
And my father was from Virginia, so they would never have met had there been no Great Migration. And there are many, many millions of African Americans who would not have existed in the ways that they now exist had there been no Great Migration. But it's a deeply American story because that really is a story of how many Americans came to be, descended from people who came from different parts of the world, and having met a great-great-grandparent that met someone that they never would have met otherwise, and then creating whole new lineages. So it's a very American story, and everything that I do, I'm seeking to build bridges. My father happened to have been a Tuskegee Airman, and after the war, as brilliant as they were and as masterful as they were in flying, and it was pretty well established by everyone that they were, it turned out that they were not permitted to work at what they loved and what they were so good at. None of them were able to get jobs out of the war, after the war, that none of them were able to get jobs as pilots. And so most of them had to go and remake themselves, abandon their dreams, and then go back to school. Some went back and went to dentistry school or whatever they might have done. And my father went and got a second degree. He became a civil engineer. So my father became literally a builder of bridges. And I'm thus the daughter of someone who was literally a builder of bridges. And that's what I seek to do in everything that I write.
When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
I would say I haven't known a time when I wasn't. I think I always, was. I mean, as a child, always writing something, whatever it was, just wanting to write. I don't know that there was a single time. I've never ever done anything but this. This is literally all that I've ever done. I've never had any other kind of job. This is it.
Well, we benefit enormously. Last question, then we'll let you go. This is a very basic one, but how many years did you spend on the research for this?
Well, it's hard to say because, I spent 15 years on The Warmth of the Suns. And so because of that, I often say that if it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long I took on. So that's how
you can't do, it's against guild rules to make that point.
And so this one, you might say, began right after I finished The Warmth of the Suns, because I've been living with this ever since. I have been using the term caste, and readers of The Warmth of the Suns went right with the flow of it. I've never heard from anyone saying, I didn't get it. Why would you use that term? It just naturally flowed. And so this you could say began, flowing one from the other, and then it kicked up into higher gear. Several years ago, after The Warmth of the Suns was out, and I was out talking about it and finding that I was literally using the word caste in every talk I gave, and it just was flowing as almost just a part of my own personal language as a result of the research that I'd done. It had become a part of me and how I saw the world, and so this needed to be written. It's not a book that I really necessarily intended on writing, but it was the book that I needed to write, and now I'm presenting to everyone. This is my report. This is the X-ray of our country. And I am hoping that this will allow us to see what we couldn't see before, and to be able to see past the barriers that have been erected so long ago, so that we can somehow transcend them.
One of the best definitions of a writer I ever came across was that the duty of a writer is to try to teach people how to see. Not what to think, but how to see. Yeah. And you've done an amazing job here. I don't know if you all know this, but Isabel got I think she may have written the New York Times review, because it was the kind of review that only authors could write, and even then we might not. But Isabel's one of the most decorated writers of our time, and this will continue. So thank you for letting me spend some time with you, and thank you to Atlanta. Kate, are you there?
I am.
All right. Well, it's an honor to be with Isabel, an honor to be with you all. Thanks so much, and thank you to Isabel. Buy lots of copies, give them away, register people to vote, do all that. Thanks so much.
Isabel and John, thank you so much. And join us on September 2nd for John Meacham to talk about the man that you can see behind him.
It won't be as interesting as this, so I would tune in. Stick with Wilkerson. That's what I want.
Okay. Thank you both so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.